Atheist Alliance International Podcast.
I don't make this stuff up.
You know, if you put Jesus Christ first, that he'll look after all your bills.
It's not fake, it's faith.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Atheist Alliance International Podcast, the first of 2023. I am Jason, aka Mayberry, your host. Joining us this week is David Rand, a co-founder and president of one of the AAI affiliates, the Atheist Freethinkers in Canada. And David is here to talk a little bit about his organization and a book he has written that came out in September, and they're going to do a formal launch later in January. So David, just before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone to please like and subscribe. So David, thank you for joining us. Can you just maybe give us a quick intro to Atheist Freethinkers and what you guys do?
Well, Atheist Freethinkers is an atheist and secular organization based in Montreal. We've been around a little more than a decade. It actually grew out of a committee that was set up to help organize an AAI conference in Montreal in 2010, and then eventually we became an organization. We've been involved in a number of activities. The most important thing recently was when we intervened before Quebec Superior Court in support of Quebec legislation called Bill 21, which is a secularism law, which we support. We're also a member of a local coalition of secular groups called the Rassemblement pour la laïcité, or Alliance for Secularism, with a number of groups which work for secularism in Quebec. I have written a book with the title Stllbirth. I'll show you the book.
Hold it up a little bit more.
A little bit more?
Yeah, there we go.
Okay. Stllbirth, the failure of secularism in the English-speaking world, how Anglo-ethnocentrism, French postmodernism, and fashionable nonsense have neutralized secularism. What the book does is it introduces, it's sort of a primer on secularism, basic principles, and I talk about the two major models. The model based on the writings of John Locke that's current in the English-speaking world, and a stronger model which I call Republican secularism, which is the standard in the French-speaking world. And I consider the Republican model far superior because it contains the all-important secularism principle. Separation principle, separation between religion and state, whereas the Lockean is kind of dubious on that. And I also talk about recent developments in recent decades, how the spread of anti-Enlightenment ideas has made the fight for secularism more difficult. Because secularism is itself an Enlightenment value, which has sort of gone out of favor currently because of the growth of ideologies such as postmodernism, intersectionality, an obsession with religious minority rights to the detriment of the majority. Of course, minorities have to be protected, but sometimes majorities need to be protected too. And so we're having a book launch on January 18th at a local bookstore. I can give you the information or a link when you want.
We'll put the links in the description for people to find.
Very good, very good.
Okay, so Stllbirth. So I presume then that is a reference to the fact that secularism has born and has kind of stuttered with the points that you make with the anti-Enlightenment left, as you described them.
Yes, I call it the anti-Enlightenment pseudo-left, but even before the advent of that particular political movement, secularism was weakly defended in the English-speaking world. The model which is current is really doesn't go past religious neutrality, and often weak religious neutrality. By weak religious neutrality, I mean neutrality among various religions, giving all religions a voice, but excluding atheists and other non-believers as if we did not exist. Whereas strong religious neutrality would include atheists in the mix. But even if you have strong religious neutrality, what you really need to add on to that is actual separation. That is, to keep religious influence out of the state, out of government. And because as soon as religious institutions gain or religious ideas gain a hold in government, or in their ideas gain a hold in legislation, then it's a threat to the freedom of conscience of the citizenry. If you look at, for example, the First Amendment of the American Constitution, which is held up as a model of secularism, it does not mention the concept of separation at all. It simply says you can't establish a state church. In other words, it's a form of religious neutrality, and arguably a weak form. It says no state church, and you need more than that. You need separation. And in the same amendment, it gives almost practically absolute priority to freedom of religious expression. It says that freedom of religious expression cannot be limited in any way. And this is not a good thing, because most freedoms need to be limited, because they bang up against other people's freedoms sooner or later, and freedom of expression certainly does. Whereas in the French-speaking world, for example, there's a law of separation passed in France in 1905, which is probably the most extensive secular legislation ever adopted by any country. It contains the word separation in its very name, and declares separation between religion and state. And there's also a better protection of freedom of conscience. The American First Amendment mentions freedom of religion, but not freedom of conscience. In the Canadian Constitution, freedom of conscience is mentioned, but it's written as freedom of conscience and freedom of religion, whereas freedom of conscience already includes freedom of religion. Freedom of religion should not be mentioned separately as if it were on a par, unless you also mention freedom from religion. In other words, freedom from religion is necessary to complete secularism.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point. So in my notes here, so you mentioned the Canadian Constitution, which, if my historical memory serves, was 1982 in Canada, I believe. We had our
yes. The original was the original was 1867, but it was modified and patriated in 1982.
Right. So you made some interesting points that I was not aware of as a Canadian and a history buff myself. You mentioned that in the preamble, it mentions the supremacy of God. So that caught me by surprise.
Oh yes, that's a rather that's a rather blatant slap in the face. If you want secularism, the very I think it's the very first sentence in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is the beginning of the Constitution, says that Canada is based on the rule of law and the supremacy of God. Now, those two things are incompatible. For one thing, yes. You can't have the rule of law and the supremacy of God at the same time. So you've got an oxymoron right away. But also, it establishes Canada as if it were a soft theocracy. Now, fortunately, that expression is limited in its scope. For example, the 2015 Supreme Court decision in the Saguenay case dealing with prayer at municipal events, the judgment said that even though the Constitution talks about the supremacy of God, that does not exclude atheists from being protected, and it's not. I forget the exact wording, but they sort of imply that it doesn't have a lot of implications. That's good. That's very good that they said that in that particular judgment, but it still remains in the Constitution, and that it has to be gotten rid of sooner or later.
And they don't declare which God. They just say the supremacy of God. So it could be any God. So presumably they mean the monotheistic Abrahamic God. So,
probably one of those, yes.
Yeah. You also mentioned that it gives privileges and that hateful declarations can be based on religious texts. So maybe you can expand on that a little bit as well. What's in the Constitution? Yes,
that's in the Criminal Code. In the Criminal Code, there are dispositions against hate propaganda, and there are two levels of hate propaganda: really serious, which are calls for genocide, and then there's a lesser form of hate propaganda, which is calls for violence, which is not the same, not as bad as genocide, but in that lighter version of hate propaganda, there are 4 exceptions where it's okay, where the declaration can be made without being prosecuted, and one of those is if it's based on a religious text in which the person believes. So, in other words, it's perfectly legal to spread hate propaganda against gay people if you're a Christian or a Muslim and you can cite the passage of the Bible or the Quran that says that, that is homophobic. But if you're an atheist, you can't make homophobic or you can't make hateful remarks against gays. So it gives a privilege to the religious.
Yeah. I would imagine most atheists probably would not make hateful comments against gays. That seems to be primarily founded in religious text anyways.
Well,
most atheists are for gay rights.
Of course, there are some atheists are homophobic, but a major source of homophobia is religion, and prejudice coming from religion is usually worse and stronger because they have the arrogance of thinking that they're agreeing with God. The people who make religious pronouncements consider themselves to be speaking in the name of God, or in the same opinion as God, and so that gives them a great deal of power behind their hatred.
Yeah, and yet homosexuality exists in nature, and I actually had this argument with another Canadian who was disagreeing with me on being accepting of LGBTQ rights, and I said, it exists in nature, and he's, human. He said humans aren't, we're not animals. I went, yes, we are. We're talking monkeys. Come on, So how can you be so discriminatory? Okay, so you made another point in your book that really also caught me by surprise. Being Canadian as well, I've always sort of admired the multiculturalism in Canada, like as they call it, the cultural mosaic. But you mentioned that multiculturalism is incompatible with secularism. So that kind of threw me, because most people would see multiculturalism as a good thing. So maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Well, it depends what you mean by multiculturalism. I mean, the sort of generic, naive meaning of multiculturalism, a lot of people think it means just cultural diversity, and how can you be opposed to that, and going to many ethnic restaurants and, sharing your living space in the city with people of various cultures. But unfortunately, it's become an ideology which means far more than cultural diversity. It's become cultural relativism. That is, attaching greater importance to the sort of community or the tribal affiliation of the person than to their citizenship, and it becomes the opposite of universalism, dividing people up into various communities. And multiculturalists tend to view, for example, Muslims homogeneously, as if all Muslims were the same. And as if all Muslim women wore the hijab, for example. Well, it's just not true. There's an enormous variety of among Muslims. Of course, there are those who are practicing and maybe fundamentalists. There are those who practice much more casually. There are those who don't practice at all, and then there are ex-Muslims. There's a whole spectrum of people. There are Muslims who support secularism. There are Muslims who oppose it. So the multicultural idea tends to put people in boxes based on one particular identity that they have, and political leaders often delegate. They speak with community leaders as if those community leaders were representative of everyone in their community. But it's just not the case. And these, for example, a Muslim imam or something does not represent all Muslims for sure, and yet they're spoken to. They're used by politicians as if they were spokespersons for an entire group of people, whereas nobody elected them. And the same argument can be used for other communities. Racial minorities. We all have many identities, and a religious identity, an ethnic identity is only one aspect of a person. So I support the concept of universalism, which is that the state should treat everyone equally and basically ignore their identities, these other various identities, which unless there are historical injustices that have to be corrected, and then some kind of measure needs to be taken to correct an injustice against a historically persecuted community, then that can be an exceptional situation. But as a general rule, the state should treat everyone, all citizens, as equals.
So this I assume then this ties back to your point about the anti-Enlightenment pseudo-left and the identity politics that they're playing is they're using multiculturalism or the cultural relativism, as you call it, to play their identity politics games. And you mentioned about like the demonizing of the European colonizers and the oppressed minorities.
Well, I mean, there are certainly plenty of things to criticize in the history of European colonialism, and there is racism, there's discrimination, there are plenty of issues to deal with. But the trouble with the anti-Enlightenment pseudo-left, as I call it, is they elevate personal identities above what we have in common. They abandon universalism. When dealing with racism, they tend to abandon colorblindness. And so they tend to encourage racism and encourage racial categories when, we thought 10, 20 years ago, we thought that we were living in the end of those kinds of categories, but now they're being brought back by this movement. And it is closely related to postmodernist philosophy, which is largely French in origin, was imported into the United States, where it became applied to activism, and especially to anti-racism, especially to anti-black racism. And it's of course, a certain degree of identity politics is necessary if you're dealing with minorities who are subject to injustice. But the point is to make those identities less and less important as the situation is improved, and these identities should become of no importance in the long term. Because all people are being treated equally. But according to the anti-Enlightenment pseudo-left, like there's no end in sight. It's identity politics ad infinitum, it would appear. And there doesn't seem to be a program for bringing it to a close.
Right. And you touch on quite a bit on the Islamophobia, and that is tied into this identity politics, the pseudo-left, in order to silence criticism have, as you mean, the stillbirth of secular values, have basically thrown secularism under the bus in terms of this misnomer of Islamophobia.
Well,
criticism.
Yes, Muslims tend to be, or at least practicing Muslims tend to be lionized by the pseudo-left as sort of victims of European colonialism, which many were. But that does not mean we should stop criticizing Islam, which happens to be a very dangerous religion if it's interpreted seriously. The problem with the word Islamophobia, of course, is that it implies that it's an irrational fear. Phobia means irrational fear. And there's nothing irrational about fearing a religion, especially its fundamentalist variant. Also, use of the term tends to conflate people with ideas. In other words, conflate Muslims with Islam, and it's one of the important concepts of secularism is that you have to distinguish between people and ideas because you have to respect people's rights, but you do not have to respect ideas. You don't have to respect religions. You don't have to respect Islam or Christianity or Judaism, and you have to be able to criticize those religions without being accused or without becoming prejudiced against the people who just have the luck or bad luck, I would say, to be born into such a religion. There's also a habit of essentializing religious affiliation, turning it into something as if it were innate, like a racial identity. Conflating race with religion, and this is extremely harmful, but Islamists love it because then anyone who criticizes Islam can be accused of racism, which of course is nonsense because Islam is not a race, it's an ideology, it's a religion, just like Judaism is a religion, and we have to distinguish between Judaism, the religion, and Jews, the ethnic group, and so the term Islamophobia is generally used by Islamists to stifle criticism, as you point out. And what we can do to stop it is to stop conflating race and religion, to distinguish between the two.
Yeah, that's one of the, you didn't make the point in the book, but I noted it, and you just touched on it briefly about like the criticism of the Jews. That Islamophobia is used to silence critics, but that's exactly the same thing that the state of Israel does. And even Israeli politicians and journalists have repeatedly pointed out that the state of Israel will hurl accusations of anti-Semitism at anybody that dares to criticize them for their treatment of the Palestinians. So this is kind of ironic that the Islamophobia and the state of Israel are using the same tactics to try to silence their critics, and anyone who would dare to challenge their inhuman and inhumane and unsecular treatment of people, that their lack of humanism, for lack of a better term.
Well, on the other hand, despite all that you said, Israel is probably the most secular country in that region, even though it's not secular. The others are even worse. But the Jewish people are in a unique position because, well, for one thing, the religion, Judaism, is the oldest of the three Abrahamic religions, and Christianity and Islam are just plagiarisms of Judaism. But also the conflation between race and religion is practically complete with the Jews. The word Jew refers to can be used to refer to the religion in addition to the ethnic group, and we really need to separate them. And by using the word Islamophobia, Islamists want people to make the same mistake with Muslims that has already been made with Jews, to conflate the religion with the people completely, and that's really it means the end of freedom of conscience. If people do not have the freedom to distance themselves from their religion, that's the end of freedom of conscience, which is a major aspect of secularism.
Correct. Okay. One of the points you made, you go into some of the historical background. You mentioned earlier about the French example of the French Republic. you talk a little bit about Jean Meslier, who's a very intriguing historical character, and many of our viewers may not know of him. So maybe you could give us a quick background on him and who he was and what he did and why he was so important.
Oh, yes. So Jean Meslier is a remarkable historical figure, just amazing. He was a parish priest in a small town in the middle of nowhere in northeastern France. He died in 1729. He had a career as a parish priest of no particular note. He was a nobody. And then after his death, they discovered a manuscript which was a manifesto for atheism and denouncing all religion, in particular denouncing Christianity, and in particular denouncing the Catholic Church. And he was a Catholic priest, of course. And it's a testament that he leaves to his parishioners, and he apologizes for lying to them for his whole life. But we understand he died in 1729. This is decades before the French Revolution, under the old the French monarchy, which was so absolutist and allied with the Roman Catholic Church. If he had come out with his atheist ideas while he was alive, that would have been the end of him. He would have been probably
for sure
been burned at the stake or something, or murdered, or anyway. And so his book has become a major document of atheism. He's probably the most important atheist in history, in spite of the fact that everything he did was discovered posthumously and not during his life.
That was pragmatic on his point. As you said, he probably wouldn't put to death. So best to leave it until after he was dead. I believe Newton did the same thing. On two notable corruptions of Scripture, I believe, that Newton wrote about some Trinitarian fiddling with the New Testament, that, again, he waited until after he was dead, because in that period of time, to be outspoken was a death sentence, or if not death sentence, you'd be imprisoned.
Heresy was a dangerous crime to commit. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Newton was a bit of a religious nut, but that didn't stop him from doing good science, fortunately. And Meslier was an important aspect of the story of Jean Meslier is that a few decades after his death, Voltaire, the celebrated Voltaire that everybody claims is an important Enlightenment philosopher, and he was, but he published a version of Meslier's book in which he totally censored all the atheist aspect and replaced it with a sort of deism or soft theism. So he turned Meslier from an atheist, and a very militant and even virulent atheist, into a sort of a liberal religious person who was very critical of the Catholic Church. And it was a very dishonest thing for Voltaire to do. And so we had to wait for others to come along later and edit more honest versions of Meslier. Yeah.
And you mentioned at the beginning, you talked about in the English world, Locke. And many people don't necessarily know that Locke himself was kind of prejudiced towards atheism. Even in his own book, on tolerance, he was quite intolerant of atheists.
Well, the irony is he was very progressive for his time, but at his time, atheism was totally beyond the pale. And so, like Voltaire, Locke was very atheophobic. He proposed what he proposed was religious neutrality, and to tolerate all religions except Catholicism. He did have a good reason for that. Catholicism had a strong pope who was like a king who ruled in a foreign country. So it was a danger of loss of sovereignty for the local king for people to be Catholic. So there was a reason for that. But he said that atheists cannot be trusted. The word of an atheist is worth nothing. That was his attitude.
Yeah, that was quite common. I mean, Hobbes himself, after Leviathan, was accused of atheism and denounced them. Spinoza denounces atheists in his writings as well. So it was quite common, even though they might have been atheists. They definitely tried to distance themselves from the label and the danger.
Well, I think it was a bit like Islamophobia today. Everybody at the time had to denounce atheism for the sake of their own skin, and today everybody has to denounce Islamophobia because you're suspected of being some horrible xenophobe if you don't.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so again, so the title is Stllbirth. It's been out since September, you said, but the official launch is January 18th. There will be links in the description for people who'd like to go find it. So any parting thoughts, David, on a point you'd like to make in your book?
Well, I just want to mention that it's available on Amazon, of course, if you can't make it to the launch. And there's an electronic version available, which is quite inexpensive compared to the paperback. And a parting thought, I would say that it's very important for Canadians to understand the separation principle and to support Bill 21 in Quebec. We've hardly talked about Bill 21 in this so far, but it's legislation which partially implements secularism in Quebec, including banning the wearing of religious symbols by certain state employees in positions of authority and teachers. And this is a very good thing because these are people who should show some reserve when they're on their job. They shouldn't display symbols of political movements or religion or commercial symbols. There's already legislation which bans political partisanship by civil servants, and Bill 21 extends this to religions for people in positions of authority. The reaction against it has been very dishonest and fanatical outside Quebec. There's some opposition similar inside Quebec, but the majority of Quebecers support it strongly. And Canadians need to come out. What we need is several atheist or humanist groups in Canada outside Quebec who will take a public position in support of Quebec Bill 21. That's what we need.
Okay. So again, the title is Stllbirth, and the topic is about the danger that secularism faces. As the saying goes, freedom isn't free, and those freedoms are under threat. So again, the link to Amazon is here in the description. You can find his book. Again, our guest is David Redd, who's co-founder and president of Atheist Freethinkers in Montreal. So thank you, David, for joining us today.
Thank you, Jason.
You're welcome. Okay, so just before we go, we'd like to remind everyone to please like and subscribe. And as we welcome everybody into 2023, we'd like to wish you all a happy and prosperous new year and wish everybody a good secular year where our values are going to increase and not decrease, as David warns us about. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, David. And we'll see everybody going forward in the year to come. Take care.
Okay, thanks for listening, and don't forget we're on YouTube, so follow us on YouTube. Just search for Atheist Alliance International, and please subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're also on all of your favourite podcast platforms, so make sure that you follow us on there as well. See you next time.